Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel Springboard Thought. I've been on a David Mitchell journey where I'm going through his entire novel oeuvre and trying to consume them all in such a way that I can kind of understand the meta story that is at play throughout all of his books, apparently, and the individual stories, and just see what sort of affiliations I can make between the characters that cross all of the books, and like I said, the meta narrative, which this book, The Bone Clocks, clues you in on. I tabbed it, and I overall quite enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, and I will explain first what I liked about it, spoiler free, and then go into spoilers after. It's actually quite difficult to talk about this book without going into spoilers, so the non-spoiler part is going to be pretty short, I have a feeling, and the rest of it is going to be spoiler filled. This book ties into Cloud Atlas, Black Swan Green, and The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. Specifically, I would say, as I was told, do not read The Bone Clocks before you consume The Thousand Autumns, because there is a meta plot point exposition where it pretty much gives away everything about the main conflict, at least, and the resolution of Thousand Autumns. So, pro tip, don't read that one after this one. Anyway, this book specifically is about a character named Holly Sykes. It chronicles her entire life. So at the beginning, it's 1984. At the last chapter, I believe it's 2043. So from teenager to grandmother, and a lot happens. So every chapter that it jumps as well is a jump in linear time, but it also changes the perspective. There's 4 other perspectives other than Holly that we get to see. The first and the last is Holly, and then throughout it we're sort of orbiting Holly, and as if she's the sun, and we're just getting glimpses of specific parts of her life, and then we infer different things about past gaps in her life, which is pretty interesting for her being the protagonist of the story. It kept me curious as a reader. It kept me interested, kept me guessing as to what happened. Why is she like this? What's going on? And the prose were fantastic, specifically with Holly's chapter. I didn't like so much Crispin's story, which is the 3rd chapter, I believe, who is a writer that is sort of like Cavendish in Cloud Atlas. He's like not got his shit together, except this time he's like Crispin is a womanizer and kind of a shitheel and stuff like that, so it's not as endearing as Cavendish, but I'll get to that. So Holly Sykes is just a pretty normal person, ostensibly, and then we learn that in her childhood she was a what she called, I think, a radio person, where basically she would hear voices. She was like a medium, is what we would probably call it now. Other people would talk to her, but also some specific people would visit her, and she called them friends, but they were probably different sort of entities than what she had known. When this grew to be more of a problem, her parents took her to a doctor named Marinus, who basically is unexplained, but closes her off from these voices. She never sees her friends again. She never hears the voices again. And then as a teenager, we catch up with Holly as she is having a fight with her mother about a boy, of course. She severs her second umbilical cord, is what she calls it, that all teenagers go through. And she goes to the boy to which she has defended and finds her best friend with him. And so her response is to run away from home. ostensibly this chapter reads like just a coming of age story of, you know, a little bit of rebellion in Ireland in the 84. It ties in pretty heavily with some music themes going on, but her only goal is just to run away as far as she can, and she's unsure if she's gonna ever come back, basically. But this chapter is also really brilliant because it sets up a whole bunch of stuff for the payoff in the end, but I can't really talk about that spoiler free. Suffice it to say, Holly Sykes has a paranormal encounter, and as soon as she is about to more or less get away from it all after this paranormal encounter, something happens in her life that pulls her back to her family, and her life is irrevocably changed. And throughout the novel we find out what that is, how it has changed her, but we also find out how the people that influence her story and the meta story that is going on in the David Mitchell books have influenced her and been influenced by her. So it's very clever, I thought. Most of it works. When we get to the supernatural aspects of the book, it can get a little sci-fi-ish in its linguistic things happening. It's lots of nouning verbs and making up specific words that seem like they would apply to very specific setting elements, basically, that don't exist yet, or it's contrives to put words that we already know into situations that don't sometimes make sense. So you can kind of tell that David Mitchell shines more as a historical fiction and literary fiction writer, I would say. But it still does make sense, and it still is a chapter that I liked quite a bit. And the meta story itself is very satisfying and does, as I had hoped, tie into all these other books in very interesting ways. It's not, I would say, a pivotal thing that the stuff that was happening in other books, but it is really cool when you see characters that are reoccurring from books and themes being hit from other books into this one as well, and simply know what's going on with these meta forces, factions type thing at work. I think that's all I can say about it without spoilers. So, spoiler time. I'm gonna go through everything I think is pertinent in the book in as much a linear way as I can think of, and then talk about how it ties into those other books that I mentioned. So, at the very beginning, we learn that as Holly Sykes runs away, she has an encounter with a person named Esther Little, who is a medium, and we don't know it at the time, is occupying a body and asking her for permission to be secreted away inside of her, but we don't know why. And then the encounter just sort of ends, and Holly thinks it's just a weird thing that happened, and she continues on her way, trying to get away from home. A friend of hers, Ed Brubeck, I believe is his name, helps her on her way with a bike ride, and they form a bond that will become pertinent in the future. But she continues on her way to her ultimate goal to be a picker at a place to get enough money and then run away from home or come back to home if they're contrite enough, something like that. But on her way, she gets picked up by two people who seem like they're just hippies. They're talking about capitalism. They're talking about the enslavement of the worker and how there's this cyclical, sick nature of the structural institutions that humans have erected. And this becomes quite clear, a clear through line throughout the book for climate change, climate disaster, and capitalism being the main means of which this is occurring. But we also then find out while she's at their home that horologists are occupying those bodies and a carnivore comes calling. So what are these things? This is where the meta narrative comes into play. There are atemporal beings which can be horologists or carnivores. Carnivores are bad. They are people who, depending on the sect we see in the book specifically, they're called anchorites, and what they do is they take people who, like Holly when she was young, are predisposed to medium-like gifts and whatnot, and have a psychovoltaic energy that can be consumed by carnivores. And carnivores lure their victims to their chapel, and it never is really explained why it has to be willingly, but it has to be willingly. And then they are decanted into a blood wine, which is drunk, which keeps these carnivores in a state of static, basically, where they don't age. They're immortal, but they can still be killed by ostensibly human means. We don't know. But they have a long lifespan by doing this. Horologists oppose these people, and they can be one or two types. One type is when they die, they get put back in the natural rebirth cycle, I guess you could say, reincarnation, either 29 years or 39 years in the future. Like clockwork, after they die, they're reborn and they begin anew with a whole new life. Others, when they die, they go directly into a new soul. And it's usually, from what I can surmise anyway, it's people who have just died. So this, we learn, is what happens to Holly's younger brother in the very first chapter. His name is Jacob. We at first are sort of just think that he's like on the autism spectrum scale, which doesn't really register anything with people in 1984 apparently. But we know he's weird, we know he's super smart, we know he's just a little bit different. It turns out, however, a horologist named Xilo, I believe is how you pronounce it, Xilo, this person occupies Jacob because he had meningitis, died, and then right after that, Xilo comes in and occupies the body, and they are now that person. And so the person that she has loved for most of his life and her life at the time has actually been a completely different person. Anyway, the horologists that are at the in the first chapter that Holly encounters when a carnivore attacks her out of the blue are Esther Little again. So two of them anyway are there. Esther Little saves Holly Sykes from the carnivore who is killed, and Esther Little then willingly, from Holly Sykes' perspective, is given a space in her mind essentially to occupy and recuperate. And I'll get into more on that a little bit later. Essentially, something has happened to Esther Little. We know she's damaged. We know she's like sick or like hurt in a spiritual type way. And we know that she can recuperate in Holly Sykes' mind, but we don't know why. And we don't know for how long. Then we skip time, and Holly Sykes is like 22-ish, I think. And we meet her through the eyes of Hugo Lamb, who is a womanizing, very morally non-ambiguous, but just a heel. He cares only about money, he doesn't care about his friends. And I won't dwell too much on this chapter, but basically he's a bad guy. He goes to Switzerland to party it up with his friends after a school thing happens, and he meets Holly Sykes. He falls for her, and most of the narrative is them getting to know each other and sort of softening to one another, finding things to like. When their relationship comes to a head and both of them sort of fall for each other, Hugo Lamb is then recruited by a carnivore from the anchorites, and basically is told, you know, you can have everything that you want in the world, or you can have Holly Sykes. And he goes for the carnivores, and we leave that little time period. Fast forward to the future, and Holly Sykes is now a wife with a daughter, and the daughter has a strange name. It's like it's Aoife, but it's Irish, so it's like EF, I believe is how you would pronounce it. Anyway, they have a daughter who's quite young. She may or may not be gifted, and we learn that Ed and her are married, the kid from the very beginning that helps her. He is now a wartime reporter who goes to Afghanistan, which is at the time still happening, and wow, very prescient for what is happening now with the United States just pulling out. It was a sobering experience reading those chapters. But we learn more about Holly Sykes via this. And basically, in both chapters, the main thing that we get is that Holly Sykes was sort of emotionally stunted and hurt very much when Jacob, her brother, goes missing, which is the thing that happens in the first chapter to call her back home. Jacob is never found, and it sort of shatters the entire family, but especially Holly. It affects how she sees other people, how she treats them, how vulnerable she is, and she never stops, importantly, looking for Jacob. But also, she wears a labyrinthian pendant that Jacob gives her, and the last conversation, I believe, he said that she needs to learn this labyrinth verbatim by memory without having any problems whatsoever. She could do it in her sleep, and it was like a very serious promise that she made. So she's wearing this pendant all of the time. She's internalized it, and we'll talk more about that later. Anyway, we find out that Holly Sykes is still sort of have a medium type thing happening with her, where she can still hear people. She goes into seizure-like things where she becomes what she would describe as a receptor for people to speak to her. But the main thrust of this story is basically just to characterize their relationship and to establish that a carnivore comes looking for the daughter to see if she has the psychovoltaic energy that they crave, and they don't. The daughter does not, so the daughter is spared, basically. The daughter then goes missing under Ed's care, and Holly is given a vision of which the exact room number 2 flights up above is where the daughter is found by them later. So we don't importantly know if she is psychic or if it's Esther Little kind of like communicating to her these things. We don't really know what presence Esther Little can exert on her either. So there's just tons of questions. The gaps, as I said, with the different jumps in chronology are very interesting. We have to fill in a lot of gaps as a reader, and like I said, I really like that, but some people might not. We then go even further into the future. Her husband is dead, killed in Syria, I believe. He is bombed as he is trying to cover it there. Their daughter is much older now in university, and Holly is a very accomplished writer of the Radio People, in which she chronicles her story in the hopes of trying to lure, or not lure, I should say, but to see if Jacob will, understand where he's from, find them, stuff like that. It's her reaching out for Jacob still. And she meets a author named Crispin Hersey, and he is an asshole. He's basically like Cavendish if he was a jerk and a womanizer and married with kids, but then leaves the kids for a younger woman and can't even make that work. This is the chapter that I have the most problem with because we don't really get that much characterization from Holly. They do soften each other and become friends, and it's not a friends to lovers trope, which I like a lot. They're just actual friends, and it's like a friendship that's born out of some interesting things that happen in their life and sort of their frailties. But it's also quite long, and I think it could have been truncated. But the main thrust of this chapter is that Holly is still psychic. She has a vision in which she sees 3 specific things whenever she sees Crispin, and she relays that to them once they become friends. And importantly, throughout this pretty long amount of time, I think, with Crispin, we find that he has a stalker who has been gifting him poetry that has weird names, and it basically alludes to the meta-narrative, the psychics, the mediums, some stuff that's happening with the world, basically. And he is basically threatened into saying, you need to read my poetry and consume this stuff, and I guess probably, talk about it with the world and stuff like that, but he never does. He ignores this completely. And he also betrays a colleague of his who he doesn't like, Cheeseman, and plants drugs on Cheeseman's briefcase when he is traveling internationally, which gets him imprisoned, and is sort of the main thing that we see Crispin doing, is trying to advocate for the release of Cheeseman. But it's a little bit boring, I have to say, and like I said, not a very strong chapter. In the end, Crispin is killed by the poet, who is mad that he never read the things that she is talking about, or they are talking about. I believe it's a girl. And she basically clues in that she knows what's going on with the meta-narrative and what's going on with the movements of the world and this invisible war that is happening with the horologists and the carnivores. And she wanted Crispin to talk about it to gain notoriety, or, to put this in the forefront of humanity, or else all is lost. And he doesn't, so he's murdered. And that's the end of the chapter. At the very end, he sees the 3 portents that Holly gave him, and means that it's his death. So not a very happy ending for Crispin. We then go into the main meta-narrative, in which we're following a horologist named Marinus, who is the same person at the beginning of the story who closed off Holly's inner eye, basically making her not worthy of pursuit for the carnivores. And we also learn that Marinus is a character who was in the Thousand Autumns of Jacob. There's an actual doctor there named Marinus as well, which I didn't clue in until they actually make it blatant. And we come to know that some of the other horologists also were present in the Thousand Autumns and influenced the magistrate to kill the abbot, who was a pre-carnivore type person, basically. Like, he was on his way to becoming one, or essentially, like, he had an unrefined process of doing the same things that they did. And they suasioned, is what it's called, the magistrate into killing Eno, which ended with the magistrate dying as well. So, in this chapter, we see Holly Sykes even older. Eof is married, and she is a geologist, I think, jet-setting around the world. Holly is not a book writer anymore, I believe, and she's brought into the meta-narrative because a carnivore is trying to take her out, basically. And the horologists are forced to intervene to protect her. In this chapter, we're given a lot of information about the horologists and the carnivores. It's the main sort of info dump of the meta stuff that's happening. It ties in again with climate change quite a lot, actually. So it's essentially says that if complacent people do nothing, the carnivores are going to destroy the world, basically, and the carnivores being capitalists. So it's a tenuous but metaphor that works quite well for me. And we learned that throughout Marinus's lifetime in different bodies, Esther has sprinkled clues as to her location in Holly Sykes' mind. and eventually this is unraveled. They're able to pull Esther Little out of Holly Sykes' memory at a specific location with things I won't go into. But she's able to be removed. She's now whole again. And the horologists plan an attack on the Anchorites' chapel using a defector who ends up being a double-crossing defector, whatever that's called, the double agent, basically. And a battle ensues, a psychokinetic battle in which all these sci-fi terms are used, but basically it's just like a telekinetic type telekinesis battle with shields and kinetic knives and things like that, basically. But essentially what they plan to do is their seat of power and where they make the blood wine that keeps them enlivened forever is in a specific chapel. It's tied to the chapel, and they want to destroy the chapel. When this happens, everybody is killed except for Marinus, who is able to go out of his body and inhabit Holly Sykes' body. And we don't really know what purpose Holly Sykes has in the narrative until now, because she can't do battle with these people. She doesn't have these special powers and whatnot. But what becomes apparent is as the chapel is imploding, in the first attack that took place during the first chapter of the book in 1984, the horologists attacked the Anchorites. It was a mess. Not a lot was accomplished, and a few of them died. One of them, Xylo, in Jacob's body. But what happens is when Jacob dies, Xylo in the body is able to sort of imprint himself onto the chapel such that when it is imploding, it becomes the maze that Holly Sykes can navigate from memory, because she has the necklace, the pendant of the labyrinth that she's internalized her entire life. When she is able to get out via the apple in the aperture here, it is a one-way sort of teleportation thing that happens, and it's used up as soon as it's used. So what ends up happening is Holly Sykes escapes to the real world. Marinus exits her body, or egresses, and he does this, we find out, because Hugo Lamb is there. And Hugo Lamb is then asked why he didn't just use it to leave and maroon Marinus and Holly Sykes, and he said it's because he fell in love with Holly Sykes back in the day. So we learn why chapter 2 was pertinent, more so than just him being recruited. They then devise like a plan to essentially teleport out, because only carnivores can do that, and we don't know if that succeeds or not. All we know is Holly Sykes is gone. We then jump even further into the future after this ostensible win, and it is a post-apocalyptic nightmare in 2043 where Holly is living back in Sheepshead in Ireland, and she has a granddaughter and is taking care of a young immigrant child who is diabetic, and she's got like her found family unit basically, and some kind of dog. But anyway, it's 2043, and what it clues us into basically is the complacency of humanity, including Holly, throughout this entire time of her lifetime, has only led to climate disaster. And what's cool about it is that it is a prelude to the final sort of novella in Cloud Atlas, where it's quite futuristic. It's Zachary's story, and there's a prescient tribe comes to Zachary's village, which they have like a strange way of speaking. It's the future, but not much is known, and it's sort of devolved into law of the jungle, tribalism type thing. It's very simplistic life with not much technology going on. But the prescients who come are like ride in on a white spaceship, and they've got all this technology, and they're ostensibly trying to fix the world, for all we know. Anyway, more on that soon. Holly Sykes lives in a village with this found family, and there's a cordon on that protects Ireland that basically implodes, and it becomes law of the jungle once again. Militia come by and start killing people. There's a little mini skirmish in the village, people die, and it seems very bleak indeed for Holly Sykes and crew. Then, out of nowhere, a Swiss submarine or some kind of advanced plane or ship comes by, and Marines infiltrate into the island and ask for Holly Sykes. And what comes to pass essentially is that Marinus did exit out of the chapel of the dusk and is inhabiting a Swiss, fairly well-to-do person who has influence over the government. And because Holly Sykes' daughter's husband, both of them who have died at this point, was Swiss, the granddaughter is eligible to be repatriated into Switzerland, which is doing much better than everywhere else in the world. They seem to have got the leg up. They've got photovoltaic technology going on and geothermal technologies, and they just seem to be like the place to be in the post-apocalyptic future. And so what ends up happening is Marinus is able to like suasion the crew and the government and whatnot to get leave for the two young people to come into Switzerland, but Holly Sykes has to stay back and will live out her days probably shortly thereafter, dying. So it's an act of kindness from Marinus, who's trying to pay her back for what happened throughout her entire life, housing Esther Little and helping the chapel, etc., etc. So the cool thing about this is in Switzerland, he says that they've formed a think tank of people who are all horologists, like the last surviving horologists apparently, and they're called the Prescients. So it's the people that become the ones in Cloud Atlas at the very end, which is neat. And then the tie-in to Black Swan Green is the Hugo Lamb character. So I have not read that, but there is allusions to Black Swan Green being a town in England in which Hugo Lamb grew up and apparently was quite a prick when he was young to some random person I don't remember. But it's a tenuous but present connection. So the things that I thought were really good about this book, like I said before, the prose, the way that we learn about Holly Sykes as an orbiting character every time is really interesting. We never really occupy her except for teenager self and very old self, or older anyway, at 70-ish. And the contrast there works very well. It's quite a satisfying story. I like that it's about climate change when it has such a large timeline going on. I like that it's essentially complacency that brings this about, and Holly Sykes also contributes to it. And I like that even though they won against the Anchorite force, ostensibly there's carnivores all over the place. They say at one point that there's way more carnivores than there are horologists, so maybe the carnivores are bringing about this end as well. We're not too sure. But in Cloud Atlas, there is that constant change into a new perspective and timeline in which there's a whole new evil to combat or whatever, right? There's new circumstances and people always need to be doing the hero stuff. They're not supposed to be complacent. They're supposed to be active and being the multitude of drops that contribute to change. And we don't really see that in the story, and it ends with, climate change. So it's neat to get a sort of like more filled in perspective on the Cloud Atlas timeline. And I like the tie-in with Thousand Autumns quite a bit as well. So I'm very excited to pick up Slate House, which is a coda to these stories apparently, from what I'm told. And then maybe I'll hit up Black Swan Green since it was mentioned already. And we'll go from there. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. I'd especially like to know if you found more to hold on to, grab onto, bite and chew with that Crispin chapter, because it does seem quite odd to me that it's not truncated, and it seems like maybe it's trying to establish more or set up something in the future, maybe. Like, for instance, we never see that poet again. It goes from, you know, the poet killing Crispin to nobody knowing still about the Invisible War. The death of Crispin doesn't seem to have brought out the poet's work or anything like that. Who is the poet, for one? I'd like to know that. Like, are they important to the larger stories? What's going on there? Is there more going on with that chapter than I saw? Because that would make the book even more interesting to me. If you have any suggestions about the reading order in which I take the next few books, I'd also like to know that. Don't put any spoilers, please. And if there's more tie-ins from the Bone Clocks into other novels that I missed, I'd also like to know that. Anyway, I'll see you next video for presumably Slade House when I finish that soon. And I will talk to you then. See you later.